What's up, guys? I'm DK, and you're watching Pro Wrestling What If, the series where I look at the different what if scenarios as terms of the world that we call professional wrestling. In early 2019, Jon Moxley, also known as Dean Ambrose, was finishing up the remaining months of his existing WWE contract. After having terrible creative plans for him that had diminished his character, he had decided to not re-sign with WWE once his contract was over. After releasing a vignette revealing that Dean Ambrose was no more, Jon Moxley would shock the wrestling world by debuting for All Elite Wrestling after the main event of its inaugural pay-per-view, Double or Nothing. Since then, he has been one of the faces of the company and has helped them become WWE's biggest competition since WCW during the late 90s and early 2000s. He would go on to have a stellar career in the promotion, holding various titles from AEW and New Japan Pro Wrestling, including the AEW World Championship that he's held for a record 4 times as of the recording of this video. Now, last year I did a video of what would happen if Dean Ambrose had re-signed with WWE for at least another year, and what the landscape of the WWE would have been like had he stayed around. Many of you have requested a part 2 to this to see the continuation of his career past the ending of that video. However, just like what I had recently done with the Cody Rhodes videos, I think a lot of us would like to know what would have happened on the other side of the coin. What would the landscape of All Elite Wrestling have been like had we not had that monumental debut of Jon Moxley in 2019? So with Double or Nothing 2025 right around the corner, for today's video we're discussing what if Jon Moxley never went to AEW in 2019. And this video will be done on a pay-per-view to pay-per-view basis on what I would think would happen in AEW had Jon Moxley not been there, starting with Double or Nothing 2019 all the way until Revolution 2020. And if you end up enjoying this video, don't forget to hit that like button, share this to all your friends, subscribe, and press the notification bell for when future episodes get released, and leave a comment down below about today's topic or suggesting a future topic for an episode of Pro Wrestling What If. Starting off with Double or Nothing 2019, the night that Jon Moxley had made his AEW debut by attacking Chris Jericho and Kenny Omega after their main event bout. Oh yeah, and I guess the referee too, since he got laid out with that double arm DDT that was prior to having a new name that wasn't Dirty Deeds. Jericho and Omega's match wouldn't have been affected by this because I do think that it was always going to be AEW's plan to crown Chris Jericho as their first world champion. Chris Jericho was the face of AEW at that point, regardless of whether he was a heel or a face, due to having that background of being a former WWE superstar that would draw fans into the product. It makes you think though, would AEW have been the company it became without Jon Moxley there at the first pay-per-view, or would fans have just regarded the company simply as the place Chris Jericho works at? Yes, there were other former WWE superstars in the promotion at the time, including Cody Rhodes, who was one of the executive vice presidents of the company. However, he never got to reach main event status while in WWE, and you can say his star power really diminished when he became Stardust during the last couple of years in the company. Fyter Fest 2019. Jon Moxley would make his in-ring debut for AEW at Fyter Fest against Joey Janela in the unsanctioned match. I guess what we would have to discuss here is what happens with Joey Janela if he doesn't get to face Jon Moxley at the event. First things first is that Joey Janela wouldn't have been placed in the main event of the show, and it's even hard to imagine if he would be on the card at all if Moxley wasn't there. Sure, I could easily put him in the 4-way match and make it a 5-way, but I think just the 4 makes sense as it shows off the future of what we would still see on AEW TV today, minus Jimmy Havoc of course. Even though Joey Janela was one of the first 5 wrestlers to be signed with AEW initially in 2019, I don't think the company ever had a vision for him, which would end up being true as his contract would expire in 2022 and didn't end up re-signing. If he did have a match on Fyter Fest, it's likely one that gets put on the pre-show, with one of the matches that we saw on the pre-show get moved up to the actual pay-per-view. With Moxley and Janela not on the card at all here, it looks like the 6-man tag team match with the Elite against the Lucha Brothers and Laredo Kid would have ended up main eventing the show instead. Fight for the Fallen 2019. Now this was difficult to figure out considering Jon Moxley wasn't featured on the card for this show. Kenny Omega had gotten his revenge on Moxley from the attack at Double or Nothing once the main event had concluded for Fyter Fest. As you'll see now, Jon Moxley had spent the majority of the summer competing in the G1 Climax for New Japan Pro Pro Wrestling against the likes of Juice Robinson, Jay White, and Jeff Cobb, who's now currently in the WWE. So I think Omega's attack was a way to write off Moxley to do that tournament, which allowed Kenny Omega to have a singles match against CIMA at Fight for the Fallen. So regardless if Jon Moxley was in AEW or not, he wouldn't have been a part of Fight for the Fallen 2019. Therefore, nothing would change from what we saw in the real timeline with the event, including the main event of the show, which had the Young Bucks against Cody and Dustin Rhodes, also known as the Brotherhood. All Out 2019. Now, in the real timeline, All Out was originally going to be when we would finally see Jon Moxley against Kenny Omega. However, the match would end up being rescheduled due to Jon Moxley being diagnosed with a staph infection in his elbow, which would require surgery to get treated, leading to Kenny Omega going up against Pac at the event instead, once again meaning that regardless of whether Moxley would be in AEW or not, nothing would change from what we saw, still ending the night with Chris Jericho being crowned as the inaugural AEW World Champion and celebrating with a little bit of the bubbly. Shout out goes to Jackson Weingart, Jada Sanchez, Fox Starkiller, Lola Pines, Hayden Saravo, Mr. Randomizer, Harry Dynamite Storm, Spidey Fan Productions 2003, and Skolchin. And the reason that they ended up getting a shout out is because they joined our YouTube channel membership, which only cost $1.99 a month. Not only do you get the shout out, but you do get lots of other perks, including early access to every single video and shorts that we produce on this channel. So definitely consider joining our YouTube channel membership. It will be greatly appreciated and it will go a long way of helping out this channel a lot. So definitely consider it, but let's get right back to the video. Full Gear 2019. Full Gear would end up being the event where Jon Moxley and Kenny Omega would have their match that was an unsanctioned lights out match. So now we're looking at what Kenny Omega would be doing during this event with Jon Moxley not being in AEW in this timeline. Now looking at the Cage Match website once again, Kenny Omega was working quite a few matches against the Inner Circle, so there are a couple of options. First would be to simply have Omega challenge Jericho for the AEW World Championship instead of Cody Rhodes like in the real timeline. Then there's also the option of inserting him into the tag team match between the Young Bucks against Santana and Ortiz by making it a 6-man tag team match with joining the Elite, while of course Sammy Guevara, who was also a part of the Inner Circle, would be joining Santana and Ortiz. Especially since I had already mentioned about Omega already working matches against the Inner Circle during the build-up to Full Gear, so that seems to be the most likely match, while we could still have Cody Rhodes against Chris Jericho as the main event, with that unfortunate stipulation that if Cody Rhodes loses, which he did end up losing, he would never be able to challenge for the AEW World Championship ever again. And the final pay-per-view discussing about is Revolution 2020. Now this one is very important to talk about because this is the event where Jon Moxley would dethrone Chris Jericho and become the new AEW World Champion. But with him not in AEW, we're going to have to dive into two things. First would be asking the question, who would Chris Jericho end up defending the title against, which I think the likely contender could be Dustin Rhodes, especially if Cody Rhodes still had the match against Chris Jericho at Full Gear that resulted in him not being able to challenge for the title again, that his own brother could avenge him and try to bring the AEW World Championship into the Rhodes family. The second thing we do have to ask is, does Chris Jericho still drop the AEW World Championship during this event, which I think he would actually still retain the championship during this timeline. None of the former WWE superstars on the roster had the star power that Chris Jericho had to be able to carry the company. That wasn't Cody Rhodes, of course, due to that stipulation. That's why it made sense that Jon Moxley was the next person to hold on to the title, since he had about the same amount of star power until the company had more time to establish some homegrown talent. With Jon Moxley not here in AEW, I think Chris Jericho would be holding on to the World Championship until All Out 2020, where it marks a 1-year reign as AEW World Champion. Homegrown talent that could potentially be the one to dethrone Chris Jericho include Hangman Adam Page, as he was the one who had lost to Chris Jericho in the match that determined the inaugural champion. Then 1 year later, at the same event of All Out, Page could finally be able to defeat Chris Jericho and redeem that loss. There's also Kenny Omega, not only because of the storyline involving the two in the qualifying match at Double Double or Nothing, but because Kenny Omega would end up being the one that dethrones Jon Moxley in the real timeline and ends his first reign as champion at the end of 2020. Or perhaps if we based it off of last year's Dean Ambrose video, I did mention the idea behind it would be for him to be in WWE for one more year. So with that timeline's deal ending in April of 2020, Jon Moxley could still jump to AEW after that deal is over and still essentially be the one to dethrone Chris Jericho as AEW World Champion. This time it would be delayed for All Out 2020 instead of Revolution 2020 like we saw in the real timeline.